Welcome everybody to the Graduate Online Combinatorics Colloquium. Today we're excited to have S. Venkatesh talk about some combinatorial aspects of polynomial evaluation codes.
Yeah, thanks. So this is Venkatesh from IIT Bombay. I hope I'm audible clearly to everyone. If not, I'll just fiddle around with my settings here. So yeah, let's start. So I'll be talking a little bit initially about the basics of linear codes, and my focus is essentially on the unique decoding problem for a special class of linear codes, which I call here as polynomial evaluation codes. And the focus is not really on the algorithm used for decoding, but on a certain combinatorial object which finds a crucial presence in the decoding algorithm. So the sequence of things that we'll take up is a bit of the basics of linear codes, and then the main decoding problem and the significance of this combinatorial object in when it comes to solving that problem, and then the main class of codes that we look at, and then how we sort of implement it in some sense. So the initial part is fairly basic, so I probably think most of you would have seen it. So if you would like to skip that part, just let me know and I'll just go forward by 4 or 5 slides. But just in case, I have the slides ready, so I'll just start with the very basics. So let's start. So what are linear codes? So we are essentially interested in vector spaces. That's what it is, because the entire tool set of linear algebra is available to us. So we fix an arbitrary field f, and a linear code is simply a linear subspace of f to the n, some n-dimensional vector space over f. And one point of distinction when we sort of do coding theory as compared to linear algebra is that we don't really try to change the basis. So in linear algebraic applications, usually changing a basis is sort of considered to be a very convenient thing to do, so that you can look at things the right way and get coordinates nicely and then work with them. But when it comes to coding theory, the way we realize codes, the standard basis is the most important basis to consider. So we do not change the basis as far as possible, because that can just mess up the other important parameters that we would have to consider later on. So the standard basis, the coordinates that are naturally given to us for the vectors, those are the most important ones, and we try to work with them as far as possible. So a linear code is a linear subspace of f to the n, and we have the standard basis for f to the n, the unit is. The length of a code is defined to be the dimension of the ambient space. So the number of components that you would have in any vector. So in this case, it is n. So the length of this code is n. And the rank of a code is defined to be the dimension inside that ambient space. So why are we really bothered about linear codes? So codes can come in different types. This more general definition, they can be non-linear too. In an abstract sense, any subset of a vector space can be thought of as a code, but we stick to linear codes because we want to use linear algebraic ideas. So why are we interested? So the whole problem is about sending a message from a sender to a receiver via a channel. And a channel by itself, if you think of it as a physical entity, it is always susceptible to noise. So in this model, what we think of is a message as consisting of certain bits, and when the message passes through the channel, the noise that the channel incurs corrupts the message, and corruption essentially means changes the symbols. And our assumption is that we have no control over these corruptions. So what do we do at the receiving end? We would like to know what the message has been sent, so there has to be some way of correcting these corruptions or errors upon receiving these messages. And how do we do that? We do that using codes. So linear codes enable us to introduce what are called redundancies in these messages. So for instance, let's take a message involving 10 symbols and the symbols can come from any set which has been agreed upon beforehand. We will fix a neat embedding into fields. So every symbol can be identified with some element of a field. And then a message of length 10 becomes a vector of length 10 in f to the 10 over the field. if you have only 10 symbols in your message and if 4 of them get corrupted, there is not really much chance of recovering it completely because you have lost 4 bits of information. So in order to make sure that we don't really lose information even on losing a few bits, what we need to do is we need to increase the length of this message by introducing redundancies. So instead of 10 symbols, we will map the same message into a larger message with 15 symbols, let's say. And this is called an encoding map. And the additional 5 symbols are supposed to depend in some nice way on the 10 symbols of the original message. And that's where we introduce these linear constraints, and which is why the linear codes are sort of very convenient objects to handle these things. And the expectation is that if the noise is not too much, if not too many symbols get corrupted, out of 15, let's say even 4 or 5 symbols get corrupted, you can recover 10 of them from the remaining ones. So how do you do that? So suppose every unit of message has k bits, where the bits are from a finite set, just as I said. So the message is an element of sigma to the k, where sigma is the formally called the alphabet. That's the set of symbols that is available to us. We encode this message into a larger vector space using an encoding function. And the larger encoded message has n bits instead of k bits, where n is much larger than k. So the additional bits that we add is called the redundancy. So the redundancy in this case is n minus k bits. And for linear codes, the most convenient way to think about it is just assume that the symbols that we take are also elements from the field. And the encoding function is in fact an injective linear map from the smaller vector space to the larger vector space. And by a linear code, we just mean the set of available larger messages along with their redundancies, which is the image of this linear map. So then what do we do? Assuming the setup is ready, a sender sends a message, it has been encoded along with redundancies. The channel introduces noise, there are errors in the message. Upon receiving the message, we would have to decode this message to get the original sort of whatever the sender intended to send us. So we apply a decoding algorithm, so to speak, to correct these errors and obtain the original message. So let's look at it a little bit pictorially. So I would be speaking words for quite some time and then try to explain the same using pictures as far as possible. So pictorially, a linear code is a subspace. I'm limited by 2 dimensions, but this hopefully makes things clear. So the encoded message, a code word, that's the sort of technical term in coding theory. We call it a code word, which is an element of the linear code that we have chosen. So the code word is an element of this subspace. Now, when you pass it through the channel, upon the receiving end, there could be some errors. So you no longer would have a code word. Instead, you would have just a word, a corrupted message. A word is just an element of the ambient space. It need not belong to the subspace. That's the difference. But now, what we would like to do is use this corrupted message or word, which I have called here as A, and see how far I can correct the errors that have incurred in A when it traveled via the channel. So the question is, can I do decoding on A and obtain C back intact as it is? So now the intuitive idea is if the received word, the corrupted message, is in some sense close enough to the original code word, that is, there are not too many errors, then there is some hope of correct decoding. So there is this inherent notion of close enough that comes into the picture. So how do we obtain C from A? We can decode if A is close enough to C. So therefore we need some notion of a distance. And in this case, the correct notion of distance turns out to be the Hamming distance, which is take any 2 vectors and the distance between them is just the number of components at which they differ. And given any linear code, so if you take 2 vectors in the ambient space which are distinct, the distance between them is at least 1, and it could be as much as n. However, if you go down to smaller subspaces, the smallest distance that 2 distinct pairs can differ by need not be 1, it could be larger. So that turns out to be a very important parameter when it comes to linear codes. We call that the minimum distance. Here I've defined it as mu of C, which is just the minimum positive distance value that the distance function takes when you vary across pairs of elements in the linear code. And this is more or less the single most important parameter when it comes to the problem of unique decoding. So what do we mean by unique decoding? Given a code word C, if the corrupted word is A, then we would like to decode A and obtain the unique value C. So we want exactly one answer for the correct code word. A list or a set of possible answers is not good enough. We will want to know what is the exact correct code word corresponding to the received corrupted word. So it comes with certain limitations. We cannot always do that. So there are a few cases that I would like to sort of talk about. So what we do here is we take the corrupted word A, and with respect to the Hamming distance, we take an open ball of a certain radius. What is the radius that we should consider? We will sort of determine in a little while. But assuming that we know what this correct value of radius is, there are three possible cases that could arise. One is that the corrupted word is too far away from the code. There is no code word that is at a reasonably close distance from the corrupted message. In which case, what we would like to conclude is that the word has been corrupted too much and decoding cannot be done. That is what we would like to conclude. The second case is the word is just too close to the subspace and there are more than one possible valid code words which are close enough to the given word. But that again is an issue for us because we would like to do decoding in an algorithmic sense and we would like to pinpoint one correct answer as the received code word. So when we have more than one which are equally close enough to the received word, the algorithm will be in a fix. It's a deterministic algorithm. So we will be in a fix which one to choose. So this is a case which we would like to avoid in some sense. The perfect case for us is when we have the corrupted word and at a reasonably close distance, we have exactly one code word from the code of interest. When we have that, we will hope that the algorithm works correctly and pinpoints to that exact correct code word and gives it to us as the output. So what's the correct value of the radius? So when we take the radius to be half of the minimum distance of the code, the second case vanishes. So that's the whole point of taking the radius to be we could take it less than half the minimum radius, but minimum radius is the maximum distance up to which the second case doesn't arise. So when you look at an open ball with respect to Hamming metric with radius half of minimum distance about the corrupted word, exactly one of the two things could happen. One is the corrupted word is too far away from the subspace, in which case it's not close enough to anything, so we better not decode it. And the second is it is close enough to exactly one code word, in which case we know what it should be. And we just decode to that point and give it as the output. So that's the unique decoding problem, and this is what we would like to do. How we do it algorithmically is essentially the decoding algorithm. And that depends on what the ambient space is, what the code construction is, and we would like to do it efficiently, so we may not be able to do it for all possible words. So there are several variations. We would like to be very specific. We would consider only linear codes which arise from polynomials. So the encoding of a code has a very big influence on how decoding and other stuff can be done. So how do polynomials arise in linear codes? So just by the name of the talk, we are concerned with polynomial evaluation codes. So code words in the linear codes that we consider are supposed to be defined using evaluations of polynomials at some set of points. So we start with a finite set of points. And we would like to think of a code word as a function indexed by the points on which we evaluate polynomials. So what is essential at this point is if every code word is a function on this set of points, we would like to introduce polynomials as unique representatives of these functions. When we have a finite set, we can always use some sort of interpolation and arrive at a polynomial representation for that function. However, we don't want multiple polynomials to represent the same function, because in that case, when we consider the Hamming distance, we could have two distinct polynomial representatives, but as evaluation vectors, they are the same, and therefore the Hamming distance becomes 0. We would not like that case to arise. So we would like to restrict ourselves to only a smaller class of polynomials, which give us one representative for each function or each code word, and only one representative for each code word. So how do we do that? We take a linear space of polynomials inside the polynomial ring such that every function has a unique representation. And therefore, by the evaluation map, these two spaces are isomorphic, the space of polynomials and the space of their evaluation vectors. And we can now identify a function with the corresponding polynomial. So once we do that, we know what a polynomial evaluation code looks like. Fix a set of points for evaluation, fix its corresponding class of polynomials. The polynomial evaluation code is just the set of all those evaluations at all those points. So every code word here corresponds to the evaluation of one polynomial from that space at the given set of points. And these are the subspaces. So if you take the subspace F, which is chosen, it gives you a smaller sort of code inside the ambient space. The ambient space here is the set of all functions defined on the set of points. Okay, so let's just leave out all the discussion and look at a few examples just to make things clear. So the classical linear code depending on polynomials is the Reed-Solomon code, and by far the most popular code that is there. Perhaps over hundreds of applications found so far and still being used and implemented in different ways. So if we take a finite field and consider evaluations on the entire field, then in order to get unique polynomial representations, we need to restrict the degree of this polynomial to at most q minus 1. The moment the degree reaches q, we have this polynomial x to the q being equal to x as a function on fq. So we start having multiple representatives for the same function. We would like to avoid that. So the degree bound is q minus 1. And now you can pick any smaller subspace using the same degree bound. So for a degree bound D, the smaller subspace that gets spanned by these functions is called the Reed-Solomon code with degree parameter D. A natural analogous multivariate case is the Reed-Muller code, where you take again a finite field and the set of evaluations is the full vector space. And this is multivariate, so you have n to be greater than 1. And here, once again, if you want unique polynomial representatives, the conditions are analogous. The degree bound is q minus 1 on each variable. So now this is the set of polynomials which give us unique representatives of all functions is all those polynomials in which the degree in each variable is at most q minus 1. And now we can again put a total degree condition, some parameter d, and look at all the functions which have degree at most d. That gives us the Reed-Muller code with degree parameter d. Reed-Muller code, I would say, is the second most popular class of polynomial-based codes after Reed-Solomon. I think, yeah, Reed-Solomon code took us to Moon. Probably Reed-Muller codes will take us to Mars. So that's the level at which these things are. These two codes are popular. In fact, if you look at arXiv, I believe you would find papers on Reed-Muller codes even in the last couple of years. So there are lots of open problems about Reed-Muller codes just in the way we have stated it, and which are relevant to different contexts, local decoding, list decoding, etc. So it's very classical. It was defined in the 1950s, but we don't understand it fully yet. There are lots of very interesting questions open about Reed-Muller codes. Let's consider slight more generalization. So instead of the full finite field, if we stick to evaluations on a finite subset, we get Reed-Solomon code on a finite subset. But then in order to get unique polynomial representations, we would have to restrict the degree bound to the size of the set in some sense. So the degree cannot exceed mod a minus 1, where a is the size of the set. And analogously, you can define it for the Reed-Muller type codes also. So here, we don't pick an arbitrary subset of the n-dimensional space. Instead, we have to stick to picking a finite grid, a Cartesian product of finite sets. And once again, the restriction on the degree is individual. The degree in xi cannot be more than mod ai minus 1. This gives us unique representations.
Hey, we have a question in the chat.
Yeah,
can you explain quickly how encoding and decoding works for a Reed-Solomon code?
Oh yeah, sure. So assume you have a message, so it's a vector, right? Let's assume that we are already assuming that the symbols available to us are elements of this field that we have chosen. So let's say we have a vector of length 10, A1 to A10. And we would like to think of these as coefficients coming from a polynomial of degree 9, because you know you can completely identify or completely determine a polynomial with its coefficients. There are 10 numbers, so you can define a polynomial of degree up to 9. So if you have 10 numbers A0 to A10, you consider the polynomial A0 plus A1x plus A2x squared and so on up to A9x to the 9. And what is the encoding? Well, we fix another set of points and evaluate this polynomial at those points. So the points are T1 to some T10, and we will essentially evaluate T at T1, T2 up to T10 and get a code word of length 10. So that's the encoding. So the encoding is not straightforward. The message gives you the coefficients of the polynomial, and the code word corresponding to the polynomial is this polynomial evaluated at the chosen set of points. So is that okay? Is that clear? Oh, I think I can
Yeah,
see the
that
chat
he
from
says
you.
yes, thanks.
Yeah, that's right. So, right. So Reed-Solomon codes are sort of evaluated on, it's a univariate case, evaluated on a finite set of points. And when you extend it in an analogous way to Cartesian products of sets in a multivariate setting, you get what is called affine Cartesian code. They are also called Reed-Muller codes over finite grids in some sense. So now, what I would like to talk about is a special class of codes which I call downset codes. It's part of, we introduced it in a joint work with Srikanth Srinivasan and Utkarsh Tripathi. So we'll be moving towards this particular class of codes, which in some sense generalizes the examples that we have seen. So how do we do that? Let's take an arbitrary grid. I'm calling it G here. It's cross product of some GIs, n variables. And let us assume that there are some arbitrary linear orders on each of these GIs. I'm calling them less than or equal to I. So these arbitrary linear orders are going to define a natural partial order on the cross product G as follows, just the component wise inequality. This will be a partial order, need not be a total order. There is a total order on each of the components. That's what we have. Okay. But now here's the thing. We have, using this partial order, transformed this grid into a poset. And we would like to talk about downsets inside this poset. So downsets are essentially subsets which are closed under taking elements below any given element. There is another word called order ideal for downsets. So given any element in this set, everything below that element should also be in the set. Such subsets are called downsets. So how do we make use of them? So first of all, we need to catch a neat hold over this grid, and a very convenient way to do that is completely map this grid in a very natural fashion to the space of n-dimensional non-negative integer vectors. So in each GI, we have this linear order. And let's say we have listed down these elements, GI0 to GIK-1. And we just map GI0 to 0, GI1 to 1, and so on up to GIK-1 goes to K-1. So this is an embedding map. And in other words, we identify each of these elements with natural numbers, non-negative integers. So when you take a cross product of these functions in some sense, corresponding to the grid G, which is inside f to the n, we get a grid in n to the n in a very natural fashion. And we collect all those and call this set of vectors with non-negative integer entries as n sub g. And this is going to be very important for us because we want to introduce polynomials, and the monomials that we consider for the polynomial functions are going to come from the multi-indices that come from m sub g. So for every I, the linear order on Gi is consistent with that on n in a very natural way. And the partial order on G is also consistent with that on n to the n. So an example should clarify things. So 2 dimensions, we have a grid G1 cross G2. We don't really know how it looks like, but it's a grid, so it's a Cartesian product of 2 sets. So it's supposed to look something like on the left side. And what we do is, map it in a very natural way. We don't try to be clever, just map it in a very natural way to a grid in n to the 2. And we need the linear orders on the two components in order to identify the integers with the elements. That's all that we do. So the moment we do that, we can talk about what are called shadows and shades with respect to this partial order. So let me just go back to the previous slide, 1 second. So what I wanted to point out is the linear orders on G1 and G2 are isomorphic to the linear orders on the two components over the naturals. And the poset structure on G gets exactly mapped to the poset structure on M sub G. So we can actually, for all purposes, identify G with Mg. Okay. So now notions when it comes to posets are shadow and shade. So we identify the points on G with the set M sub G, and for any point alpha in M sub G, the shadow is the set of all elements which are below alpha, and the shade is the set of all elements which are above alpha with respect to the partial order that we have. So the shadow is denoted by delta and the shade is denoted by del. So now in an abstract sense, over a poset, as I said earlier, a downset is a subset such that for any element in the set, everything below it also belongs to the set. So in other words, for any element in the set, its shadow is a subset. Such a set is a downset. So this is one possible example of that. So the pink region is the downset, P is the poset, and you take an arbitrary element A, the shadow is completely inside D. So when we come back to the grid and the associated integer grid M sub G, a downset is supposed to look something like this. And the isomorphism of the two poset structures essentially say that every downset in G goes to and comes from a downset in M sub G. And that's essentially what we would make use of. So now we come to the main the object that we are interested in. These are called downset codes. As I said a little while earlier, I would most of the times identify a monomial with the multi-index corresponding to it. And let's start with a classical result. I'm mentioning one reference here, Gale and Thompson, but I think you would find it at multiple places. So it's a very classical result, which is that if you take the grid G1 cross Gn and look at its corresponding integer grid M sub G, identify monomials corresponding to the vectors that are at M sub G and take the span of all those monomials. So you get a space of polynomials. This space of polynomials is isomorphic to the function space on G. And it's a very, very classical result. So essentially, if we go back to this diagram, we have a grid G here. Every function on this grid can be written as a linear combination of monomials coming from the grid on the right. That is what it says. And it can be represented uniquely. That's what it is. So, in other words, every function has a unique polynomial representation with all monomials in M sub G. And it's quite easy to prove, so I'll just skim through it very quickly. So take any element in the grid of evaluation points A and look at a corresponding integer point, that is some alpha. And now we look at this very nice function f sub A. So f sub A essentially look at the projections of the element A along each axis. And we have a linear order there. So collect all terms which are strictly less than AI. Take the corresponding linear factors and multiply all of them. So it's just a product of linear factors. But the neat property of this polynomial is that the non-zero set of this polynomial is exactly the shade of alpha. And the complement of this shade is the zero set. So these are essentially analogous to step functions in the univariate case. So they will essentially span all functions on the grid and this will form a basis. Okay, so that's the proof idea. So what are downset codes? So we start with a finite grid and take a downset inside M sub G, a set of points which is closed under taking shadow. And the downset code is essentially the span of all the monomials indexed by those points. That's all. So this generalizes most of the examples that we have seen so far, and it's a much larger class. The rank is exactly equal to the size of the downset that we have taken because the monomials are all linearly independent. And as I mentioned earlier, when we identify monomials with their multi-indices, what we also note is that the partial order on M sub G is exactly the divisibility partial order on monomials. So when you take downset codes, you have this added property that given a monomial function, every factor is also going to be in the same space. You don't jump out. So you can do division, you can do substitution into a few coordinates, you can do projections. You will still remain within the same subspace. That's a good property. So let's just go back to the examples that we have seen in a diagrammatic sense. So the Reed-Muller code, classical affine Cartesian code, if you take an arbitrary grid. In 2 dimensions, it's essentially a single degree parameter imposed on the set of monomials, which gives you something that looks like a triangle. So there are 2 variables here, x and y, and you have a down set of monomials defined by the total degree condition. That is the Reed-Muller code or the affine Cartesian code. You could put degree bounds on each of the variables separately, independently. And in the one variable case, if you put a degree bound, you get Reed-Solomon code. And when you do the same on multiple variables, what you get is a tensor code. It's essentially a product code. Essentially 2 copies of Reed-Solomon codes tensored to each other. And the dimensions essentially multiply. So this is a much larger code. Now you can try all sorts of things. So you can do individual degree bounds combined with total degree bounds. This is some code which is not equal to any Reed-Solomon code or any Reed-Muller code. In general, you can take any downset of monomials and it gives you a downset code indexed by the monomials belonging to that downset. So what about decoding? So the theorem in our paper is that there is an efficient deterministic algorithm that does the following. Given a grid, given a downset of monomials and a received word. So now we are back to the unique decoding problem. The code is the subspace that we are interested in. The ambient space is the space of all functions on this grid. We pick a downset and the downset defines a proper subspace. This is our linear code. We are looking for code words in this subspace. Given a word, if it is close enough to one code word, exactly one code word in the downset code. So close enoughness is sort of characterized by the radius equal to being half the minimum distance. So if there is a code word in this downset code that is less than half the minimum radius away from the given word, then the algorithm will actually output the correct code word. If not, the algorithm would still output some code word from the linear code, but it may not represent the function that we out to receive. Okay. So a small zoom out of the diagrams that we have seen before in this case. So the only 2 cases that we can have are either the received word is too far away from the code, in which case the algorithm will still output a code word which will not represent the given word. In the other case, we have exactly one code word that is close enough and the algorithm works perfectly. So let me just take you through the outline of this algorithm. I won't describe it in full detail. This is just to illustrate where the minimum distance is playing an important role. Why are we really concerned about this radius? So the input to this algorithm, I'm calling it downset decoder. A finite grid, a downset, and a received word. And now we are working with polynomials. We know that the functions have unique representations from the span of the downset that we have chosen. So assume that the code word that we're looking for is P. And decoding essentially amounts to determining the coefficients of this polynomial. So assume that it is P and we use an inductive approach on the number of variables. So you can separate out the last variable and write it down as a polynomial in xn, where the coefficients are now polynomials in the first n minus 1 variables, x1 to xn minus 1. Now we go to a projection. The nice thing about downset codes is if you project to lesser number of coordinates, a downset code gives you another downset code on the smaller set of coordinates. So let's project from n coordinates to n minus 1 coordinates. You get a smaller grid, which we call G tilde, and you get a smaller downset, which we call D tilde. So now each of these coefficient polynomials Pj's in n minus 1 variables are supposed to come from code words in the downset code defined by D tilde on the set G tilde. Then what we do is we decode these coefficient polynomials one by one using several instances of the downset decoder on n minus 1 variables, which is sort of guaranteed to us by inductive hypothesis. So we use several calls to this smaller downset decoder, decode all of these coefficient polynomials, and then put them together and obtain the original polynomial. So the idea here is decoding one polynomial in n variables is equivalent to decoding a bunch of polynomials in n minus 1 variables. So now the fourth step that I've written here involves some work about what kind of projections to take, what sort of instances of the smaller decoder one has to call. But I'm not really going into the details of the algorithm. Instead, let me point out to you the last step of this. Once you receive the polynomial, what is the guarantee that it's going to represent the received word correctly? The theorem only says that as long as the code word, the received word is close enough to a code word, the output is correct. But a priori, we don't know if the received word is close enough. So we make a check at the end of the algorithm. At the end, we have an input received word and an output code word. We measure their distance. If that distance is less than half the minimum distance, then it implies that the algorithm replied correctly. If that distance is not less than half the minimum distance, it means the polynomial that we received does not represent the received word at all. There are just too many corrections. That is where knowing the minimum distance is important. So important that we need to know it exactly. Getting lower or upper bounds on this quantity is not going to be enough. So, just a second. Why are bounds not enough on the minimum distance? If we have a strictly lower bound on the minimum distance, then we run the risk of concluding that there is no correct code word, even if there was one, because we are looking at a smaller radius. And if we have an upper bound, a strict upper bound, and we look at a larger radius, then we have the risk of concluding that we have a correct code word when there was none. So in either case, having strict lower bound or strict upper bound on the minimum distance is not going to ensure that the algorithm works correctly all the time. If it has to work correctly all the time, we need to know the minimum distance exactly. And that's when a combinatorial characterization helps. We will characterize this minimum distance in a combinatorial fashion, such that the minimum distance itself can be computed efficiently. So this is the connection. So given any two code words in a downset code, the Hamming distance between these two as vectors in that subspace is exactly equal to the set of non-zero points of the difference. So by nz, I mean the complement of the zero set of this polynomial. So all we need to know is the corresponding quantity in terms of non-zero sets that corresponds to the minimum distance. So what is that? The minimum distance among any two code words is exactly equal to the minimum size of any non-zero set corresponding to the non-zero polynomials in that space. And that's the connection with polynomials. So now in order to know the minimum distance exactly, what we need to know is how small can the non-zero set of any polynomial in that subspace be. And here is where we use a classical result called footprint bound. I might have written it here in a slightly different way just to make it easy for this talk. But you will find it at several places. It's a very classical result. You will find it in several places in several forms, and they are all more or less equivalent to each other. So take any function in your code, we'll define max of f to be the set of maximal monomials, maximal in terms of the partial order that we have on m sub g. And for any non-zero polynomial, the size of the non-zero set is bounded below by the shade of any of the maximal monomials that are present in that polynomial. So that is the lower bound on the non-zero set in terms of shades. So just to illustrate, if we have a polynomial which has these pink points and this green point in its monomial support, these are the only monomials that appear there. Then the green point alpha is a maximal monomial here. And the size of the shade of this alpha is a lower bound on the set of non-zero points of the polynomial. How do we see that? Well, let Z be the zero set of f and take an arbitrary function on Z and extend it to the grid. And now H has some polynomial representation. Let beta be a maximal monomial there. And what we conclude is that we can always reduce this monomial as long as it is inside the shade. So we do it in an algorithmic fashion. So if H0 is H and if beta is something that is in the shade of alpha, then we can just multiply f with the monomial x to the b minus alpha. F is anyway 0 on Z. So the new polynomial H1 that we get, which is H minus x to the beta minus alpha times f, it's equal to H on the 0 set. It's the same function. Functionally, it is the same. But as a polynomial, we have got rid of this larger monomial beta, which was inside the shade of alpha. And if we do this enough number of times, we can make sure that all the monomials inside the shade of alpha are gone. So the monomials in the function are all within the complement of the shade. And therefore, hk for some k is going to be in the span of m sub g minus shade of alpha. But this was an arbitrary function. So what this means is that the dimension of the function space on Z is at most the size of m sub g minus shade of alpha, right? But the dimension of the function space on Z is the size of Z. So the size of Z is at most size of g minus shade of alpha. Take the complement. Therefore, the non-zero set of f is at least the size of the shade of alpha. So this is the sort of the main input into characterizing minimum distance. And is it clear so far? Is there anything? Okay, fine. So going ahead, this bound is sharp. It's not just it's not a strict lower bound. So we again go back to the same nice polynomials that we had looked at earlier. So take any element in the grid and corresponding to it, look at the product of linear factors. We already saw that its non-zero set is exactly the shade of alpha. But what we also see is that the monomials that appear in this polynomial are exactly the ones that are in the shadow of alpha. And therefore, the maximal monomial of this polynomial f sub a is just alpha, nothing else. And therefore, for this maximal set, the size of the non-zero set gives you an equality in the bound. So this bound is sharp. And the sharpness is what we use to completely characterize the minimum distance. So this is the result that we have on the minimum distance of downset code. Given any downset code, the minimum distance is equal to the minimum size of shade of all the monomials that are in the downset. And that's what it is. So the downset looks something like this. And look at all the monomials in the downset. Well, essentially, you only have to look at the extremal points, the maximal elements of D, because the shades are smallest when you go up. So you just range across all the maximal elements of D, look at all of their shades, whatever is the minimum size among them all. So in this case, it's the green point, which gives you a small yellow rectangle, which is the smallest size of the shade. That is equal to the minimum distance of this downset code. That's what the result says. So importantly, this combinatorial description gives us a way to compute the minimum distance efficiently. Efficient in the sense, it's not polynomial in the number of variables, it's polynomial in the size of the downset. Because the grid itself is an input, so you need at least that much time. So you can always compute it in time polynomial in the size of a grid. So let's just go through the proof. It's essentially the same argument, just a little bit more, a few more lines. So we already know that for any polynomial here in the downset, its maximal element must also be in the downset. And therefore, by the previous footprint bound, the size of the non-zero set is at least the minimum size of all these shades. And we already have the polynomial that makes it tight. So you just take the monomial in the down set and look at the corresponding product of linear factors. That gives you equality. So these both together conclude that the minimum distance is exactly equal to the minimum size of the shade. Okay. So the minimizers here are exactly products of linear factors. That's a good point to note. So yeah. Okay, so I hope up to this point it's clear. This was the main part of the talk that I wanted to sort of present to you. The specific class of codes that we get from polynomials, which are useful almost everywhere, and we have lots and lots of applications for special instances like Reed-Solomon and Reed-Muller codes. We have a larger class of codes. We have a decoding algorithm for it, which I have not detailed completely in this talk. But the crucial part of getting the decoding algorithm to work all the time is the complete characterization of the minimum distance, no matter what downside you take. And what we show here is using a classical result called footprint bound, we can actually characterize the minimum distance combinatorially and compute it efficiently. And therefore, we can actually implement the decoding algorithm and make things work. So that's as far as downset codes are concerned. With respect to minimum distance, the discussion ends here. I would just like to spend a few more minutes towards the end to see how this idea of shades extends to other combinatorial quantities related to these downset codes. So there are generalizations of minimum distance called generalized Hamming weights. So minimum distance is also called Hamming weight for a code. So just to fix some notation, a support of the vector is the set of all indices that is non-zero. A support of a set is the maximal support of any vector that is there. Now let's start with an arbitrary linear code, not polynomial evaluation code, just an arbitrary linear code of rank k. Now we look at subspaces of this code. So since the dimension of this code is k, we can look at subspaces with dimensions ranging from 1 to k. And we define the rth Hamming weight of this linear code as follows. The smallest support size of any subspace having dimension r. This is a generalization of Hamming distance, because when you look at the non-zero sets, or essentially the support of vectors inside the code in order to compute the minimum distance, the support of any given vector is equal to the support of the one-dimensional subspace spanned by that vector. So when you take r equal to 1 and you look at the minimal support size, you get exactly the minimum distance. That is the first Hamming weight. Okay. And what do we get in terms of downset codes? So we already knew a characterization for the first Hamming weight for downset codes in terms of shades. Now we try to do it for generalized Hamming weights. So let's start with the grid once again and a downset. We know that the first Hamming weight is given like this. The first equality is essentially the definition in terms of non-zero set. The second equality is a characterization in terms of shades, right? Analogously, if you just look at the first part of the equality, what one can conclude is that in order to look at r-dimensional subspaces inside the downset, you have to take r linearly independent polynomials and look at the minimum non-zero set size of the common tuple f1 to fr. So for a tuple f1 to fr, we define a point to be a 0 if each of those polynomials vanishes at that point. And a point is a non-zero point for this tuple if at least one of them is non-zero. So the at least one of them being non-zero condition should suggest that shades appear in this characterization in terms of unions. And that is exactly what we have, which is the result that we have here. So for any r between 1 to the size of d, the rth generalized Hamming weight of this downset code is essentially the smallest possible size of the union of r distinct shades that you could take corresponding to monomials in that downset. So in other words, you take a subset of size r inside this downset. Just by the shade condition, you only have to look at elements in the boundary. the maximal elements. So take any maximal subset in the downset of size R, look at its shade, count its size, range across all such subsets. The minimum size is equal to the rth Hamming weight. However, as R varies from lower values to larger values, this characterization may not be enough when it comes to computability. It may not, you may not be able to efficiently compute it. So for small values of R, you can do it 1, 2, 3. As far as R is constant in comparison to the downset size or the dimension, you can always compute it efficiently. For certain shapes of the downset also, you can compute it explicitly. So when the downset looks like a triangle, the Reed-Muller type condition, you can explicitly compute all the generalized Hamming weights for any R efficiently. There is no restriction whatsoever. And that's one of the results by Beelin and Datta last year. So they give explicit formula for the RH generalized Hamming weights for the affine Cartesian codes in general, because it's a grid of evaluation points and the downset looks like a simplex in some sense. So computing the size of the shade is very easy, and the minimum is essentially attained by R of them, R points on this simplex arranged in a specific way with respect to some monomial order or something. So they just give a formula, so you can efficiently compute all of those weights. In general, for downset codes, it may not be computable because an arbitrary downset, you might be forced to do brute force search across the set of all collections of size R inside this downset. So then we might have a problem. There is another extension to this, what are called relative Hamming weights. Here we consider two codes, one sitting inside the other, and K is sort of the difference between their ranks. And for any R between 1 to K, we have this pair of codes, C and C prime sitting inside C. And the relative Hamming weight, the RF relative Hamming weight of this pair is defined to be, again, in a very similar way, the smallest support size of any subspace of C with rank R, such that it intersects the smaller code trivially. Okay, so it's a slightly more general concept, and it might look abstract in this sense, but it's very useful when it comes to polynomial-based evaluation codes, because the relative generalized Hamming weights enable us to characterize certain the behavior of polynomial codes when it comes to certain decoding settings like list decoding, local decoding, etc. So they have applications in some sense. So these are generalizations of generalized Hamming weights in the sense that the generalized Hamming weight is just C with 0, the pair C with 0. So the smaller subspace that you take is trivial. And we can characterize similarly the relative generalized Hamming weights for our family of downset codes. So now you need a pair of downset codes, one sitting inside the other, which means you need a pair of downsets, one sitting inside the other. Let's call them D prime sitting inside D. And the characterization is again very similar. So for any R varying between 1 to the size of the difference, the Rth generalized Hamming weight relative is again the size of the smallest shade of R distinct monomials lying in the difference of these two downsets. So you don't vary across the larger downset, you vary only across the difference of these two downsets. And again, this is not efficiently computable all the time. For small values of R, which is constant with respect to the dimension, or for specific shapes, for example, grid, triangles and all, you can get formulas, and therefore these quantities are also computable efficiently. So again, for example, in Datta's paper 2019, you get explicit formulas for the affine Cartesian code pairs. But in general, for downset codes, even this characterization will not give you an efficient algorithm for larger values of R. So, however, yeah, so that's essentially the end of the talk. I just wanted to point out how this combinatorial object shades sort of pop up in giving nice characterizations for parameters which are sort of very important in a coding theory perspective. And it's not that they are very abstract objects, they find applications in computer science when it comes to different kinds of decoding settings that we would like to look at. So Yeah, that's it. That's the talk from my side. I think I'll open it up for questions.
Thanks for this talk. Let's give a round of applause. We can use our clap emojis to thank Venkatesh.
you.
Are there any questions from the audience? Good. If there aren't any questions for the audience, let's thank the speaker again.
Yeah, thank you.
Now we can